All right. Lesson 12, the last one, in a total of 13, including the introduction. And I called this lesson, Let's Bring It Home. And I didn't exactly know why I was calling it Let's Bring It Home. I thought it was just a wrap-up of the course. But as I was praying and thinking about this particular lesson to actually wrap up the course itself, God was really speaking to me to share a story, and we're going to read it together as well. You can read it in your manuals. That is a story that is very close to my heart, and many of you will know the story, and that's why I have actually chosen a Bible version that I normally don't even read from, because it's very paraphrased, very loose. But sometimes when you read it in a total different way, because the wording is a bit different, it can come to you as if it's the first time again. And hopefully it will be that way for you. So it's the story of the prodigal son, the lost son. You can read it in Luke chapter 15. If you open your manuals, you can see the whole story. And I'm taking it from the Message. So normally I take it from the more traditional translation, New King James, New American, sometimes I read King James just for some references here and there. That's a very reliable translation as well. But this time around, this is a translation from Eugene Peterson. He passed away not that long ago. And he paraphrased the entire Bible. So you will see that it's very loose and you think like, I knew this story, but I thought the wording was a bit different. Don't worry, it's just a paraphrase. So let's read it together. As of verse 11, where I start, it says this: Then he, Jesus, said, There was once a man who had 2 sons. The younger said to his father, Father, I want right now what's coming to me. So the father divided the property between them. It wasn't long before this younger son packed his bags and left for a distant country. There, undisciplined and dissipated, he wasted everything he had. After he had gone through all his money, there was a bad famine all through that country, and he began to hurt. He signed on with a citizen there who assigned him to his fields to slop the pigs. He was so hungry, he would have eaten the corn cobs in the pig slop, but no one would give him any. That brought him to his senses, he said. All those farmhands working for my father sit down to 3 meals a day, and here I am starving to death. I'm going back to my father. I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against you, God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son. Take me on as a hired hand. In another translation, you can read there the word slave, right? He got right up and went home to his father. When he was still a long way off, his father saw him, his heart pounding. He ran out, embracing him, and kissed him. The son started his speech, Father, I've sinned against God, I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son ever again. But the father wasn't listening. He was calling to the servants, Quick, bring a clean set of clothes and dress him. Put the family ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then get the grain-fed heifer and roast it. We're going to feast. We're going to have a wonderful time. My son is here, given up for dead and now alive. Given up for lost and now found. And they began to have a wonderful time. All this time, his older son was out in the field. When the day's work was done, he came in. As he approached the house, he heard the music and dancing. Calling over one of the houseboys, he asked what was going on. He told him, Your brother came home. Your father has ordered a feast, barbecued beef. You can see how free the translation is, but you get the picture here. Before, he has him home safe and sound. The older brother stalked off in an angry sulk and refused to join him. His father came out and tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't listen. The son said, Look how many years I've stayed here serving you, never given you one moment of grief. But have you ever thrown a party for me and my friends? Then the son of yours who has thrown away your money on whores shows up and you go all out with a feast, his father said, son, you don't understand. You're with me all the time, and everything that is mine is yours. But this is a wonderful time we've had to celebrate. The brother of yours was dead, and he is alive. He was lost, and he is found. Just let me quickly ask, any of you did not know this story? First time you hear it. I think everybody heard it. Maybe you've seen a version of it, something on TV, or you might have seen a modern rendition of this very famous story. Yeah? And I think, and the reason why I chose this story particularly is because I think it summarizes this course very, very well. You see, most of us, when we hear this for the first time, when we become a Christian, we usually understand this story in terms of forgiveness of sins. Oh, it's my father, I was a bad boy, I came back to the Father, he forgave me of my sins, and now I can have a relationship with him again. And that's obviously not incorrect, it is correct. But I would like to suggest that there's so much more here in the story going on. And I think that if we really zoom in this story, we're going to see that this has everything to do also with identity. Our God-given identity. So, I would like to rethink the prodigal son story within the framework of kingdom identity. I don't know if you remember, but towards the beginning of the course, I said that the good news story is not just forgiveness of sins, even though that's obviously part of it, but there is so much more involved in it. Alright? Keep this in mind. So the first element of this story that we just read is that there is a relationship that is broken. Yeah? I'm going away from here. The son, the younger son that wants to go away from the father. We all understand this has to do with the relationship between us and our God, the Father. Alright? The attitude of the Son represents all of us in some ways. It's the brokenness of humanity without God that wants to self-govern, control, and live life for itself rather than for God. Alright? That is the element that we usually get down really, really easy. We understand this part really, really well. May I suggest to you, like in the beginning of the course, I was also talking about two other aspects of the gospel, of the good news. And the second aspect, and you can just flip back into the beginning of the course, I think it was the good news, I think chapter 3 of your manual. There is another aspect of the gospel that's very important for us to understand, is that something went wrong in terms of authority and destiny. Remember that in the beginning I was saying? Adam and Eve were given a certain authority, but they forfeited it by committing sin and everything. And you can see that in the story of the prodigal son, as he is asking for his inheritance. Show me the money. I want the money. Give me what is mine. He obviously had the right to the inheritance, but he could never ever ask for the inheritance while the father was alive. That would be the same thing as if you would be telling to your father, Father, I wish you were dead. Very freely translated. It's an authority that he didn't have the right to ask for it. Alright? So the first one, relationship broken. The second one, the authority and destiny that went totally wrong, simply by asking for something that wasn't his time yet to receive. And then finally, and that's what I already saying, and that's part of the part of the bad news, is that this young son that ran away from home basically with all that money, he lost also his identity. Why did he do that? You need to understand the culture back then. Being part of a family. Particularly people from Eastern cultures here will understand this concept of family even a bit better. The shame culture of shaming your family by doing something that brings shame to your father's name is something really, really big. And this son that ran away from home obviously brought a lot of shame, first of all, upon himself. He wasn't part of the family anymore. Nowadays, in a Western culture like Australia, we almost take it for granted that all kind of families are broken up and not so super functional anymore. But if you understand it is in this context, he lost his identity, his last name, so to speak. He was a nobody. Nobody really knew him, and the only way for him to be a somebody was spending it on parties and just, spending it on whatever. That's why it's called the parable of the prodigal son. Alright? So we have three aspects of the bad news. Relationship broken, an authority that, was given away in the bad news story that I explained it. Here it went wrong because he was asking for something that wasn't his right. And he lost his identity. He wasn't part of the family anymore. But now here's the good part, obviously. It's like, and that's why it's so beautiful to see this story as the gospel in a story form. We all love stories, right? Watch a movie or read a novel or something. And I think in this story, you can see all three elements of the bad news and all three elements also of the good news. So let's go to the relationship first. Remember, relationship was broken. Well, we can see in the story that the younger son, realized, like, what was I thinking? I'm eating here with the pigs. Remember Jewish culture? What do Jews not eat? Pigs. They don't eat pigs. Listening as a Jewish, audience, they listen to this story. They're like, he is eating stuff from the pigs. Nobody could fall even, further from, it would be a terrible life to live this way. And he realized that, as a matter of fact, when you read the story in the Message, and I even put in italics, it says in verse 17, that brought him to his senses. That's another way of saying, you know what, I was walking in one direction, I think I need to go back to my father's home. What did I call that throughout the course? Repentance, exactly. It's not the bad old sin word like, you sinner. It is simply thinking like, you know what was I thinking? I was walking in the one direction, let me walk into the Father's direction again. Alright? Very important to understand. Now you see a couple of elements in this story. Those are very important for us to understand about the relationship that's actually restored. First of all, the embrace. The father that hadn't seen his son probably for years on end, without the son even properly saying something, he just said like, oh, I've sinned, I'm a bad person, call me a slave instead of a son. And all that the father does is simply embrace the son. The relationship is, in that sense, restored. In an Eastern culture, and when you read the story, this is obviously in an Eastern culture, a kiss, even though we're men, probably on the cheek, let me suppose it was on the cheek, that was a gesture of affection, of intimacy, of being close to one another. Alright? So you see already two elements that are like the embrace and the kiss that shows that God the Father, obviously, and people were listening to it that way, understood it that way, that God really wanted to restore the relationship again. But there is another element as well. It's the sandals. Can you imagine this guy? Just try to picture it yourself. He was probably walking around in clothes that, you would stay really, really far away. Any of you has ever been walking perhaps in CBD and you come a homeless person that hasn't taken a shower for a week on end or something? Any of you has seen a person like that? And then the smell? And then sometimes the teeth that are coming out a little bit like that, and they all of a sudden they approach you and you'll be like, whoa! What's all that? Well, I can picture, obviously I don't know that, but I can imagine that the scene was quite something. He was walking barefoot, no sandals. You don't go really far without sandals, right? It's amazing. The Apostle Paul, he uses, and we use it also in the armor of God, the sandals as one piece of the armor of God, right? It stands for the gospel of peace. Reconciliation. So we understand that the fact that the Father gave sandals to him symbolically also wants to say something. It's really God restoring the relationship with human beings again. Alright? So we understand, relationship restored. This is the part that we usually understand really, really well. Yeah? But I have also showed you throughout the course, even though I didn't talk about it a lot yet, because we zoomed in a lot on identity, is that something else was restored as well, part of the good news. And that was the authority. Remember? The authority that was restored. And that represents something else in the story, the ring. The ring. Have any of you has seen the movie Ben-Hur, the older version? Right? So you know that scene where Judah Ben-Hur is in that slave ship, and then I think he rescues this guy that is very rich and stuff, and then he is being adopted as his son because he saved that person. What does he receive? He receives a ring for an adoption. And an adoption in those days, and it's not different in the biblical story, not just meant that, oh, you're now part of the family. The ring also represented authority. It's a concept that for Westerners is so strange, like authority. We have more kind of like an authority crisis. We don't even understand sometimes what authority might look like. But in those days, a restored authority, the father giving the ring to the son, meant, listen, you did what you weren't supposed to do, but I'm restoring not just a relationship, but I'm giving you the authority also back again to be a son. And that brings me to the third one. It's the identity that is found in God again. In the Message version, it just said, like, just give him a set of new clothes. If you look into the older translations, you see particularly that he was robed in clothes. Robed in clothes. Alright? This, again, the son coming home looking absolutely horrible, spent his time with pigs, smelling really, really bad, and then all of a sudden the father comes, asks his servants, like, clothe him in new clothes. It's a picture of the righteousness of Jesus Christ that is robing us with his identity. Remember that there was an identity swap going on? I said that many times. You received the identity, the righteousness, the right standing with God from Jesus Christ, and all your sins were nailed on that cross. It's a picture actually of what God really wants to do in our lives. Is restoring our identity. Now, let's have a look quickly at the main actors in this story. I mean, the younger son we can easily identify with. I mean, we all remember perhaps an episode in our lives that we weren't exactly walking with the Lord, or we were doing something, or we might not even, we maybe weren't even raised in a Christian home or anything, and all of a sudden we realize, like, hey, wait a second, I cannot keep on living this way, and you realize that you find your purpose actually only in God. Yeah? So it's relatively easy to understand this whole story from the perspective of the younger son. Okay? But it's interesting that the story is not just about the younger son. As a matter of fact, the story is a lot also about the older son. The older son, remember, the audience, Jesus was telling this story, and there were, just imagine, a whole multitude of people, poor people, nobodies, tax collectors, people that weren't very popular, probably were very corrupt, everybody despised them, they were all sitting there, and there were some scribes, like the scholars, and some Pharisees, people that were very religious and very zealous for the law of Moses, all sitting there, and all of a sudden, he starts to tell this story, and while everybody could perhaps identify himself with the younger son living a reckless life, it was particularly those people that were sitting there listening to this story thinking like, hey, wait a second, that older son, is he talking about us here in the story? Because when you read again from the Bible, you see that this older son is doing things that are unimaginable in an Eastern culture. Confronting his dad the way he did would be totally unacceptable. Today in a Western society, we see that sons sometimes can just mouth off to their parents, but not in this story. In this story, it would be unimaginable. Alright? You can also see that this son, even though he was doing everything right, he wasn't doing it with joy. He was doing it like some other translations, like I'm always working, I'm always slaving myself for, to work for you, and I never cause you any grief. And then this low life comes that spend time with prostitutes. The story never said that, by the way. Yeah? He probably made that up in some ways to make the younger son really, really look bad. It represents people all over the world, in all ages, that have embraced God, but have embraced God not with a lot of joy. They have religion. Oh, I have to do this, cannot do that, not allowed to do this, must do that. But there is no joy in the whole conversation. And as a matter of fact, when the Father, obviously representing God the Father, wants to lavish the younger son with mercy and grace, that really upsets the older son, because he thinks like, I've always lived my life so neat and nice and beautiful, and that's how you treat the younger son? You kill the fattened calf? He spent his money, his inheritance on whatever, and you welcome him in like that? You see, that's what religion does. It cannot understand grace very well. It has a difficulty with understanding it. Finally, the father. The focus of the story is not so much the older son or the younger son, for that matter. No, the focus is about the nature of the father. This story really wants to show the love, the mercy, the compassion that God has for us. It's amazing. And that's the whole point, I think, that we're trying to go through as we went through this course. God sees you and me as lost children that need to come home. That's why I called this lesson, Let's Bring It Home. And when we do that, instead of walking one direction, we turn around and like, you know what? I'm going to walk into God's direction. It's called repentance. It's not one of those dirty words. It's actually a beautiful word. It's an identity word. We can start all over again. And it's by His grace, through our faith, remember the magic duo, that God starts to transform us. Now let's compare the younger and the older son very quickly. And we do that in closure. It's easy to see the differences between the younger and the older, right? The older trying to do everything right, the younger trying to do everything very wrong. It's very obvious to read that into the story. But you know what? I have found, and I've read this story so many times in my life, and I'm now seeing a lot of things in the Bible to the perspective, to the understanding of identity, which is a very core message. It's simply this: both of them don't really know who they are. The younger son, identity crisis, the younger son walks off, doesn't want to have a relationship with the father, wants to live for himself. We get that. That's probably the easier part to understand. But the older son also doesn't really know what he has, because all this time he was in the presence of his father, of God, but he didn't enjoy it. For him it was, oh, I have to do this, I have to do that, I'm trying to live my life in a certain way, and there's no joy in it. In this story, the biggest embrace that you can have in your life is to embrace really who you are. And that's very often not what we think we are. We were talking about this today. Like our identity, when we are born, and particularly in the teenager time, but also when we have our first romantical experiences, we start a family, and we start our jobs, and so many other things. We live in a world where a lot of things are already pre-formatted, already constructed in some ways. Our bad experiences, things that were said about ourselves, things we started believing about ourselves. And even though we perceive that as reality, it's still a construction of what was going on around us. And God is literally trying to deconstruct that as much as possible, because the biggest enemy that we are facing ever in our lives, it's ourselves. The last two lessons that we were talking about had a lot to do with our thinking. Remember, the armor of God is our identity, So anything that the enemy tries to throw at us, it's our identity that keeps us firm in the battle. But it's not just that. It's also when those thoughts come up. Last week we were talking about it. We need to know how to deal with that stuff. And it is through our identity and understanding what is going on. A lot of people don't understand what's going on. They think that these bad emotions and bad feelings and depressions and anxiety and negativity, that it's just normal. Whereas, as a matter of fact, there is so much going on here that if you start realizing it and you start understanding the fight that you're actually in, and you also know the weapons that God has already given to you and me, things start to shift. So the big question is, who do you think you are? Ultimately, that's the big question. You know, God might be... Remember in the beginning, the very first lesson, when we were reading a couple of Bible verses together? You might want to even go back. Maybe you want to do that. It might help you a little bit. I think it's page 12. I mean, you see all those beautiful Bible verses, and they all relate one way or the other to identity, who we are as people. It says, for instance, John 1:12, in Christ I am God's child. John 15:15, I am Christ's friend. 2 Corinthians 5:17, I am a new creation. You know, and then you can read the corresponding Bible verse. Remember in that lesson what I also did? I simply asked all of us here, like, which of these verses do you have a hard time in embracing? Because remember, God might be saying some stuff about you, while you, in your mind, that sometimes your biggest enemy, some can be, say something different about yourself. Oh, I'm a new creation. Nah, if they only knew. You understand what I'm saying? That's what I'm trying to make clear. So, ultimately, faith is a very big thing. There are basically two reactions possible. Yes, I believe what God is saying about me, and I embrace it. Or no, I don't. I don't believe it. And you still hold on to whatever that might be. Alright? Finally, and here we're going to finish already. Identity always has a price. Identity always has a price. Remember in the story of the prodigal son? What was the price that the father had to pay? He slaughtered the fattened calf. That's a representation actually of Jesus Christ himself in many ways. For God to restore our identity, he went bankrupt. He gave his son. We all know the story. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Identity comes with a price. To embrace that, it also means to understand what Christ actually has done for us. It's here where the journey finishes, and I've enjoyed it very much to do this together with you. Were moments that I thought like, oh my goodness, what kind of journey I started here, because writing it, which he also knew, like days on end, writing and everything. But it has shaped me in very profound ways, I think. And I hope you enjoyed it. So I'm going to ask Shalini to stop and